Hi everybody, my name is Jens Larsen. In this video I'm going to take a 2-5-1 in the key of C major, and then I'm gonna go over a long list of different options for substituting the 5 chord so that you have a lot of different ways of harmonizing or reharmonizing a 2-5-1 in the key of C. This can be really useful if you're trying to compose a tune or rearrange or reharmonize a standard. And of course it's also something that you can sort of apply to your solo playing and then see if you can find new and interesting ideas from those chord sounds. If you want to learn more about jazz guitar, understanding chord progressions, using substitutions and other music theory, then subscribe to my channel. If you want to make sure not to miss anything, then click the little bell notification icon next to the subscribe button. If you have a favorite substitution that you use really a lot and it's not in this list, then leave a comment on the video and let me know about it, because it's always nice to get new ideas. That's also the reason why I'm making this video, is just to give you guys just a long list of possible things that you can check out and use as an inspiration. Let's get to it. So of course the first one will just be the plain old 2-5-1, and even though I'm making a list of how you can change the 5 chord into a lot of other things, it is important to note that with any of these, but especially with the simple ones, you really just want to have all your basic options down and be good at just playing different melodies on top of those chords, just to use all the variation you have available there, because that's probably going to be more practical in most situations. The next thing we can do is to try and change the 5 chord into a sus chord. So now play a G7 sus 4. That could be something like this. Of course, changing it into a sus chord, or sometimes you'll see it written out as a D minor 7 over, or an F major 7 over G, is a nice sort of change in sound. It's not as strong because we're missing sort of the third, but it's a good one to use, and maybe it's also one that sometimes, at least I forget to use it. I'll much quicker start going into also dominance and stuff like that. So the first one you want to check out after you've done that is probably the one where you borrow the dominant from harmonic minor, which is what I did here. So that kind of dominant will have like a flat 9 and a flat 13, but also a normal 5th. You can also play a G7 altered. That could be something like this. So of course the altered, now that we're in the sort of the realm of the altered, you get a few more options. You can also start messing around with just playing the G and then using like different upper structure triads, like in this case the E flat and the D flat major triads, to get sort of a more vague sound but still coming out of the altered kind of idea. So that'd be something like. With the alter scale, I think the important thing is that we have the flat 9, the sharp 9, and then the flat 5 and the flat 13. Those are sort of the alterations that really will stick out, and it's that combination. With all these next examples I'm going over, so both with harmonic minor and altered, diminished and whole tone, it's sort of different combinations of what kind of extensions and alterations we have available that's going to give that specific color, and you want to be aware of that because you want to emphasize exactly that color to really pull out that you're using that one. If you're just playing a G7 flat 9, it can be all sorts of things. At one point you might want to really sort of make a decision about, well, I want it to sound like altered, I want to sound like a diminished or harmonic minor scale. So that's also something I'm going to try to put in there when I'm playing the chords. The next choice would be the G7 that you find in the diminished scale. So that will sound like this. So the characteristic sound here is that we get the flat 9 and the 13 together. I think those are the most sort of typical colors for that sound. You also have a flat 5 or a sharp 11, in fact, and a sharp 9, but they're used a lot less commonly, I think. Sometimes you'll have like the flat 5 in there as well, together with the 13 and the flat 9. And then what you have is basically a C sharp minor triad over a G. That could be this type of sound. The whole tone scale is an interesting scale in the fact that it's pretty much only has one type of chord in it. And it's not a dominant sound that I use really a lot, but there are songs that will use it if you check out some of the stray horn, and also when Shorter's Juju has a lot, sort of a long stretch of whole tone scale. A 2-5-1 with a whole tone dominant would sound like this. So these first few examples were just taking the G7 and then changing the sound of that. So you could argue that it's not reharmonizing if we keep the same root, but actually it is, because we're changing the sound of the chord and we're choosing different extensions and different sounds, and really that is a part of how you reharmonize, of course. The next thing we can start to do is to really just change the chord and play other chords there to get a different sound, and to maybe also disguise the fact that what you're playing is a cadence. I think that's very often the effect that you're kind of looking for. Basically, when you're reharmonizing, you're probably trying to or disguise the fact that something is a cadence, or resolve it to a place where you're not expecting to go. That's very often the point of a reharmonization. Probably the best place to start with that is to just use tritone substitution, because obviously tritone substitution is a sort of standard thing in jazz that's been used really a lot. So that's a very common substitution to get in there, and you will also really get that on the fly while playing a song quite often. If we're playing this cadence, and then the tritone of G7 is D flat, and then we get a D flat 7. And the D flat 7 sound you get here is usually a Lydian dominant. So in fact, D flat Lydian dominant is of course the same as A flat melodic minor, which is the same as G7 altered. So G7 altered and the tritone substitution with Lydian dominant is very closely related, because they are actually, in terms of what melodies you play, almost impossible to tell apart. One thing you can do that gets a little bit further away and makes it maybe a little bit more surprising is to play either like a complete cadence on the 2-5, so you on the tritone dominant. So in this case, that could be like an A flat minor, D flat 7 to C major. You can of course do that still, keeping the D minor in there, and then adding a tritone 2-5 like this. Another thing you can do is also just to play the D flat 7 as a sus chord. Really what we're doing here is just because when you have the Lydian dominant, you kind of have the G in the scale and it ties back to the key. When you play the sus chord, you don't have that anymore. So you're just going even further away, really, and that's the point of making that a sus chord. A quite large group of chords that I use a lot when I'm trying to reharmonize or make alternatives to cadences in my own songs and reharmonizations is the 4 minor group. So that's the group of subdominant chords that are coming from the minor key. And if you're using them major, then that's a sound that's quite common in jazz standards. And it's also something that I think it's a little bit sort of far away, but it's also still feels quite safe. And therefore it's a nice sort of stable tool to use when you're trying to reharmonize. So the idea is, of course, we're in C. And now we're going to substitute the G7 with some sort of subdominant chord. The first thing to think about is just really just the F minor chord. And there are a few variations on how you want to do that. So the first one would just be to play, let's see, the D minor, and then the most common 4 minor is probably the F minor 6, and then resolving that to C major. And then you can of course make variations on that, because this is sort of using the F minor melodic scale as a 4 minor sound. And you can use other sounds as well. So of course, in this scale you already have the F minor major, and then you will get this type of sound. So that will work. The minor major sound is of course a little bit less stable and maybe has a little bit more color than the minor 6 sound. So that can be something that can be useful to sort of take advantage of when you're trying to reharmonize. Of course, you can also just use really C minor as the scale that you want to take the F minor from, and then you get like an F minor 7 chord like this. So then you get this. probably the second most common 4 minor chord that you come across is the backdoor dominant. So in C major, that's the B flat 7. So that would be this B flat 7 with a 13. Most of the time this is played out of the F melodic minors as a Lydian dominant, because it's a dominant that doesn't in fact resolve. So it might have a sharp 11 or a flat 5. And if you put it in a cadence, it sounds like this. And a variation of that would of course be to not use the melodic minor scale and then really make it like a sus chord, like this. And then you get this type of sound. Another very useful chord that you can use from the 4 minor group is the one found on the flat 6. So in C, the flat 6 is A flat, and the chord you find there is an A flat major 7. So again, depending on what kind of scale you're going to use when you're going to find your A flat, you have a few different options available. The most common one is just basically just the A flat major 7 as this, and that will sound like this in a cadence. Kind of has almost very much like a bossa nova, also because it is found, Chopin used it in quite a few bossa novas, so it has a bossa nova flavor to it, and also it's something that's used quite often in pop music as well. So of course we can start varying this. One sort of very common variation is to make it into flat 5, so major 7 flat 5, and that sounds like this. Where the flat 5 is of course a little bit more spicy in sound, and not the major 7 sound is of course very nice, but also in some ways a little bit boring, and adding the flat 5 makes it just a little bit more interesting. Of course you can also take this chord out of the F melodic minor scale, like you would use the F minor major chord, and then you get an A flat major 7 sharp 5. And that could be used like this. So here we really have like a C major triad over A flat. So it's almost like we're just kind of suspending a few notes in the chord that we're going to really resolve to. But it can be a really nice sound, and it works essentially just like the F minor major chord. A last place where you can also find an A flat major 7 is if you think from C harmonic minor, and this A flat major 7 has a few different sort of kind of out there extensions, which is a nice effect to use also, because if you look at A flat major 7 in that scale, then we just have the A flat major 7, but then we get a sharp 9 and a sharp 11, so we get a chord sound that's something like this. You can also play it up here. It's very closely related to playing an A flat major triad and then having a G major triad on top of it. So it really sort of gets into the area where you can't really tell if it's a subdominant or if it's a dominant anymore. The Neapolitan subdominant is also a great minor subdominant that you can use, and the Neapolitan subdominant is essentially the minor subdominant, so in this case an F minor because we're in the key of C, and then with the flat 6 in the bass, like this. So that means that this chord in jazz we just consider that to be a D flat major 7 in the key of C. And if you use that, then you can get something like this. And of course you can make a variation on that where you don't play it like a normal major 7, but you made it into a major 7 flat 5, and that could sound like this. One G7 that I didn't mention at the beginning is the G7 you get if you take G7 from minor, so you have a flat 9, but you don't play a normal dominant, you'll play a sus chord, and then you have this sound, which is a G7 sus 4 flat 9. You can also kind of think of this is sometimes being referred to as a Phrygian chord, because that's basically the scale that goes with it. So in this case you would really play like a G Phrygian, or which would be the same as E flat major or C natural minor on it. If you put that to use in 2-5-1, it sounds like this. The G7 sus4 flat 9 is actually a really nice sound to have in there, and there's a lot of places where you can use it because it's only if you have like a 9 or a third in the melody of the dominant that it really gets you into trouble. And you will of course also have a version of it where you have a natural 13 that's used sometimes, so you're coming out of F melodic minor, and it also makes a great sort of pedal point for intros because it's a little bit mysterious sounding and maybe a little bit more interesting than just a normal sus chord. There are a few chords also that are kind of similar to what you will encounter in folk music, so music that's kind of older than tonal music in a way, and that would be the 5 minor chords. The most basic one of those is of course just to have the dominant, so the G chord, but then as a minor chord. That could be like this. Once you have the G minor, you can of course also use a B flat major, which is something you might see. Again, it's a kind of progression that I somehow connect really with bossa nova. So that sounds like this. A trick that's also really useful if you're trying to reharmonize and come up with some new chords is to take a chord that's already reharmonized a bit and then see if you can turn that into something else. And you have a few places where you can do that. One of the most common ones is if you have a G7 altered, then just to take another chord from the alter scale and then use that instead of the 5 chord. So probably let's try and do that with the first one would be like an A flat minor major chord. So that clearly works, just because this chord sounds very, very similar in the context with the G7. And if we can use this one, we can also use probably one that's even more common as a reharmonization, which is the B major 7 sharp 5. And one more that sounds really good is to use the B flat 7 sus4 flat 9. So that could be something like this type of chord. And in the context that could be... This is very common in the melodic minor type sound, and you can actually do the same also with a tritone substitution. So if we take, instead of playing the D flat 7, which is a normal tritone substitution, we can take the 2 chord, like the A flat minor, and then use that. That sounds like this. And since we can do this with the A flat minor, we can of course also use the B major 7. That would sound like this. And this one, it kind of almost sounds like we're really using sort of a chromatic approach from D minor up to the E minor, which is like the other structure of the C major 7. But maybe that has a little bit more to do with how I'm voicing it. We can kind of do the same thing with the diminished scale, of course. But if we look at the diminished scales, then the one that has a G in it, in terms of dominant chords, will have a G7, then it'll have the B flat 7, which is also kind of taken by the 4 minor sound, and the D flat 7, which is kind of like a tritone substitution. So the only one that's really different here is the E7. So here I'm really trying to pull out the sort of diminished sound on the E7. So that's a 13 flat 9 type sound. Sometimes this connection is also used to just associate an E7, sort of just a basic E7 out of A major with a G7, and then use that. Then you get this type of progression. Which also can work quite okay. So of course I can't cover all options, because then this video is going to be 2 hours long, and it's not that interesting. What I can do is maybe just talk about some of the different groups, and also how you arrive at some of these reharmonizations. So the ones that I've talked about now have been sort of the major groups, and then also just a little bit how you kind of come up with more chords out of those groups. We can of course go a little bit further, so to do that, let's combine two. And one way to do that is to think of the D flat major 7, which is a 4 minor chord, and also the B flat 7, which is also a 4 minor chord. And sort of the combination of those two would maybe be a B flat minor. That's at least sort of the way I associate my my way into this. So I would kind of consider this to be some sort of, probably mostly because of the fact that there's a D flat minor somewhere on top of the B flat here. I would consider this a 4 minor type chord, and I would use it like that. So that works as well. In the same way, we can of course also take the D flat major 7 like this, and then instead of thinking of it as being a 4 minor chord with a flat 6 in the bass, we can make it a 4 major chord with a flat 6 in the bass. And then actually what we have is a D flat major 7 sharp 5. That will sound like this. So what I'm starting to do here is actually I'm just taking some of the slightly altered 4 minor sounds, if you want to call a D flat major 7 an altered 4 minor sound, but some of those, and then just trying to see, well, what happens if I turn it into a major chord. Another one where we can do this is to take, maybe use like an F major, so just a straight ahead 4 chord, but then put the 4 minor in the bass. This is really getting close to actually playing some sort of A flat 7 chord in terms of how I voice this. But in the context that would sound like this. And we're getting into areas that are more and more vague. And it's a little bit like the lower level of the chord is resolving in one way and the higher level is resolving in another way. These types of combinations and this way of coming up with new chords can be something that you can just take out. It's really about what you can make work in the context, and it's also a good way to just see, well, what happens if you do this. It's good to explore harmony in that way and just experiment a bit with what works, and then see if you can use that in the song or in the music that you're playing. Of course, even with a long list like this, it's quite likely that there are some chords that I didn't talk about here that you use and that's not on the list. So if there's something that you use a lot and you think this is a great chord, then leave a comment, because it's always nice to learn something new, and I might start asking about where you use it so I get some idea about it, because that's another thing with this video. I'm just playing a 2-5-1 example and you don't really get the context. You kind of need to try and apply it to a song maybe to really get an idea about what it sounds like. Other than just in a 2-5-1, I think. But that's for you to experiment with as much as it is something that I can actually do in a video. And of course, there will be other videos where I'll be reharmonizing tunes and applying stuff like this. I actually already made a few that I like that. If you want to learn more about jazz guitar, about improvising or reharmonizing like I talked about in this video, then subscribe to my channel. I publish a new lesson every Thursday, and I've been doing this for quite some time, so there's already a lot of material available on my channel. If you want to support me and help me make all these videos, then check out my Patreon page. I'm very grateful for the small community of people that I have on Patreon that support me financially and help me find the time and the money to make all these videos. So check that out if you want to help me. And for the rest, there's a new lesson on Thursday, and thank you for watching. Until next time.